Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change.
Our life has been, for the last 20 years, I'll say this, focusing on effective communication. And that is at the heart of being able to be effective at what you do, whatever field you may be in, as long as you're interacting with other people. If you're an individual contributor, and this is sort of a platform for us to maybe even get started, that if you're an individual contributor, none of the stuff I'm talking about, none of the stuff in my books really applies to you. And when I say an individual contributor, someone like an arbitrageur, somebody who sits at home and has, $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 to invest, and they do their investments, and that's how they earn a living. They don't have to interact with anyone except a computer to buy and sell stocks and bonds and whatever they're selling. Those people don't need any of these skills. If you're interacting with other people, and collaboration is important, loyalty is important, engagement, interaction changes the nature of a culture, that's where this kicks in as it relates to communication. So I think that's probably enough on who I am and some of our general philosophy and direction.
Well, let's jump right into this great book, The Power of Evolved Leadership. And really, let's start with defining leadership, because everyone has a different definition of it. Like you just stated, it's not for individual contributors. This conversation is more for leaders. But really, what is a leader and what does that position really entail?
Well, let me take that question that you just mentioned and your entree into it about leaders. I want to establish how we see leadership. And leadership sometimes is hierarchical. The leader is the person with power and control. That is often how people look at leadership. We don't look at it that way. We look at everyone being a leader, everyone within an organization, as I alluded to earlier. If you interact with people, if you're a member of a team, we believe that everyone at all levels has a role and a responsibility to be a leader within their respective groups. How I interact with that group as a leader helps to drive things and move them forward. So we see a leader as anyone who has the ability to, in fact, some of the times when I've done these sessions, I'll ask people, what's your definition of leadership? And what are the skills required? And they'll say things like, well, a great leader has to be intelligent. Well, certainly. They have to communicate well. They have to have knowledge of the business, charisma, a number of things, vision, and the list goes on. And when we're done compiling that list, what I suggest to them, and we don't have all the answers, we'll just give you our perspective. What I suggest to them is that all of those are requisite skills. We certainly need them, but they don't define great leadership. I could be intelligent. I could communicate well. I could have charisma. I could understand the business. I could do a number of things along those lines. That doesn't make me a great leader. On the real impact side of leadership, we're looking at those skills and traits that have a direct influence, to answer this question, direct influence on the performance of others. Things like people who know how to motivate, people who can inspire others, people who can enable others to live up to their potential. True? But the only way that a leader can do any of that is the way he or she sends you a message. And it's not so important what I say, but rather what you hear that matters. Because I can believe that I'm sending the same message to two people, but because of the nature of our relationship, there are often some subtle differences in the ways that I send those messages, in ways that I may not be conscious of doing differently, and in many cases in ways that you're not conscious of receiving differently. But they do get sent, they do get received, and they do get acted on. And that's the essence of what it takes, we believe, to be an effective leader.
When you touched upon some of the central tenets already of your PMV leadership model, which I'd love to unpack with you now, on really what makes a great leader and that performance piece, the motivation piece, and really the values piece, which is often the most subjective of the three. But perhaps you can go a little bit deeper into each of those three elements, and then we'll spend a little more time on that value piece.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I'd like to talk about that. We spent a lot of time, Barbara Hockfield, my partner, on trying to shape it in a visual form, if you will, a model. I'm not a fan normally of models, but we thought it was important for this. And we decided to break it down into four discrete categories. You alluded to some of them. Three of them are directly connected, inextricably linked, if you will, and one sort of floats on its own, but among the other three. And the three that are connected on the arch, if you will, are performance, motivation, and vision. PMV. Performance is very straightforward. Performance is basically completing accomplished tasks, getting the job done, meeting goals, targets, objectives, the general sense of how people are measured as it relates to those kinds of activities. Motivation, which I alluded to a moment ago about how important that is to leadership, is inspiring, getting people engaged, committed, and being a part of a process because it has been absorbed by them and they believe in it and want it to be, not are told to make it, but they genuinely have embraced it. It's a part of their innovation and creativity as well. The vision is looking at the future. What do we need to do, not just today, because that's not being an effective leader. We don't just accomplish the current tasks. We have to look at what this is going to evolve to. Obviously, things like how is AI going to affect our business in the next 3 years, 5 years? I've been saying 3 and 5. I've now been shortening that to 1 and 3 and 5 because things are operating at such an incredible pace, and it's almost proverbial not knowledge to everyone that speed of ascension is so great and so steep that you need to plan out not that far, but much closer in terms of your vision and where you're going. Those three can't be separated. The values piece that you alluded to is also an important one, but it floats on its own because it's much more subjective. What what are values? How do you define what values are? And in this context, values has to do with, am I proud to work here? Does this company do things that make me feel like I'm respected? Not just making money, but I'm respected. Is there integrity here? Do these values align with my personal views and direction? Are they both done internally and also externally? How does this organization help the outside progress of society? And those things that sometimes are very important to people. I would not want to work for a company that, and I'm sure everyone knows about these what do they call them, call centers that call out to people and do all sorts of scamming of the elderly to get them to invest in things that aren't necessarily terribly reputable, but a number of things that callers will do. These people know what they're doing, but they don't care because their values aren't there. I just want to make the money. I could never work there, no matter how much they paid me. My values have to align more closely with the work that I do. Otherwise, I can't sleep at night. So, this is the area of values and why it's so almost amorphous. For some, it's very critical. I have a close relative, and I don't think I'll mention the company, but I'll just say it's a social media company. And she was working there. And she said, you know something? I don't feel that my life is doing what's important. There's so much of the stuff that goes on social media that I just don't respect. And I don't want to be a part of that. I'm embarrassed to say that I work for that organization. I'd rather say I work for a company that when people hear the name or learn about it, that it's something that they can respect, admire, and that I'm a part of that. That's where the values piece really kicks in and why it's so sensitive. There's a lot to be said about values, which I'm happy to tell you more about how it parses out as well.
Well, yeah, and it's a very subjective nature of the value sector. It's the hardest to quantify, but ethics, what you state, really lies at the center of this, and it can be mapped into two separate channels.
Yeah, the two channels that are very critical, and there's a field of study in the academic community, which I've been bringing into the corporate world. The two channels are deontological and teleological ethics, all under the category of business ethics. But deontological ethics really has to do with what's right and wrong. Done. It's right or it's wrong, period. It doesn't vary based on time. It doesn't vary based on circumstances. It is right or it's wrong. Teleological ethics is all about how it plays out. You make some judgment calls. I jokingly like to say the teleological example on the negative side would be the kid who comes to mom and says, Mom, would it be wrong for me to do this and spells out what the kid wants to do. And that the mother's response would be, why don't you do that and tell me how that plays out for you in the back end? And if it worked, then we'll say it was good. And if it didn't work, then we'll say it was bad. I mean, those are, that's an extreme example of how teleological plays out. And in the workplace, we are faced with these kinds of decisions all the time. One that is very popular in the academic community for analysis. Let's say you're walking along the shore of a lake. You look out there and you see somebody, they look like they're drowning. They are drowning. And you want to help. So there you look down, and there at the dock, there's a boat, has the keys in it. You start it up, take it out there, you pull the person in, you save them, but they're hurt. You drive to the other end of the lake to the hospital, you get them in the hospital, you've damaged the boat along the way. But the owner has come out, hearing his boat start and taking off, and calls the police. Says, this guy, and gives your description, just stole my boat, heading over to that side of the lake. The police come over, they catch you. The question is, should you be charged with theft? Should you go to trial? And if convicted, and there's no question that you did it, pay the penalty. This is a question I thought just for discussion for you and me now. What should be done?
I can make the argument the end justifies the means, right? If I save that individual's life, then that's pretty compelling evidence to suggest that it was worth doing, and hopefully I'll get some relief from the crime.
Absolutely. The end justifies the means. And there are many people who in ethics say that that's a terrible way to look at what something that defines whether something is ethical or not, the end justifying the means. Now, the reason that's, I think, particularly important in the workplace is that we're not faced with decisions that involve stealing boats, but we are faced with decisions on how we judge the people who work for us and work with us. And just recently, a case came up where this company had a very strict policy on expense reports. If we find that you've done anything inappropriate, if there are any improprieties in your expense report, we have a zero tolerance, you have to go. And they were doing that until one of their top performers had a minor mistake. This wasn't trying to steal thousands of dollars. This was a minor mistake, but it was an intentional one. This is someone who, in the Wall Street community, managed hundreds of millions of dollars of accounts. And if he were to go, he'd likely bring a large percentage of his clients with him. The company was faced with that decision. Do we fire him in line with our zero tolerance? Or do we say, well, it's this guy, and he's got so much of our business tied up in his grasp. So what do we do about this? Their decision was that business was more important than consistency. And they said, you know what? We're going to make an exception. And if somebody complains about the exception, we'll deal with it when it comes up, but we're not going to lose what amounts to, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of client assets. When we make decisions internally about how we judge people, one of the other elements with values is, do I apply things differently to different people? Meaning, not just because of the power that they control, but because I like you. I don't like you. Is it based on race, gender, tenure, any number of other factors? So these are things that we need to wrestle with when we look at those kinds of values along those two channels of how we apply it.
That's a great distinction to make, and one that I was unaware of prior to reading your book, which I think is a great piece of that first part of the book. When we look at leaders, there's always core traits of great leadership, and they always come up, right? And you list 10 of the most common ones in your book. I like to examine a few of them with that expanded perspective within this framework, if that's okay. And the first one that I think really bears a greater depth or a greater insight into is respect versus being respected. Everyone wants to be a respected leader, but being respected is different than showing respect to someone in certain contexts, correct?
Yes. Basically, it has to do with pretense. That I can show respect, but it doesn't mean that I respect you. I can go through the exercise of respect and do all the proper protocols of respect, but I may not respect you. I think that most people want, as it relates to respect, the genuineness of that. Now, this gets very involved, and we spend a lot of time on this in the book. And this is what someone would get out of spending time within it, is the recognition that sometimes not presenting it based on your personal, honest, authentic feelings may be okay if it accomplishes the objective. And we're going to talk about authenticity being the goal. I'm sure at some point we'll probably discuss that because that's a core element of the book as well. But let me give you an example of how respect versus respected, being genuine about your thoughts versus following a protocol of behavior. Let's look at an example. Um, Someone once said, Steve, I'm going to challenge you on this. At one point, I had said, what's important is the behavior, not necessarily your inner feelings. And they said, let me challenge you on that. Tell me something. If someone were a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and that person you discovered your boss was, say, member of the Klan, even if he did all the right things, would you be able to work for that person? And it was a tough decision because it's such an extreme case, of course. And after thinking about it, I said, yes, I would. In fact, let me outline exactly why and how it would play out. It would depend on how they executed it. If that boss came in the mornings and had a smile and came up to me and said, good morning, Steve, how you doing? How was your weekend? That's great. By the way, how'd your daughter's concert turn out? Really? That's great. I'm so pleased, so on and so forth. By the way, I came up with this article I saw over the weekend. I've got to show this to you. I think it's going to really help you with the project. And later on that day said, you got plans for lunch? Let's go to lunch. I found this new great restaurant. Let's spend some time over there. And was warm and engaging and interactive with me, and then gave me regular, rich, meaningful feedback that had real value and application. Wrote my performance review in a way that was accurate, supportive, and developmental. I made sure I got a great bonus at the end of the year, and all of these wonderful things done with a tone and gesture and nuance of support and wanting me to do well. I would rather have that person as my boss any day of the week than someone who genuinely, warmly liked me, but didn't do those things well. So now we have this interesting conflict where do you want the reality of the person's position, or do you want them to execute the task for you? And our position on this, somewhat controversial for some people, is I'd rather take the accurate treatment. And examples of that is your lawyer. I don't care if my lawyer is warm and genuine and I know how he really feels. In fact, he could hate me as long as he's a great lawyer. My doctor, if my doctor doesn't think highly of me, my only concern is that he is up to date on all the right medical conditions and what needs to be done to keep me healthy. My plumber, my electrician, I don't care about their genuineness. I care about their performance. And that's one of the areas where this gets really intertwined is we look at performance because we're in the workplace. And we separate that from emotional relationships. So there's transactional and emotional relationships. In the workplace, it is dominantly transactional. So we look at demonstrating respect and not necessarily what's in your heart. Now, that's an involved perspective on it, but that's sort of an overview of how we play that out.
When you state that the objective of an involved leader, right, is to focus your attention entirely on the equitable treatment respectfully, regardless of your personal feelings about them, I find, though, many leaders proudly express that they treat everyone on their team equally, sometimes extolling that sentiment, right, that I treat everyone the same. And you say that's a really misguided approach.
Terribly. I think it is, yes, terribly misguided. It's never about equality, it's about equity. I don't want sameness, I want same value. I don't want you to replicate what you do for someone else. I just want you to do it well for me based on my particular needs. So, yes, it's never about sameness. Example, I have a son and a daughter. When my son was much younger, I'd come home from work and we'd play. Sometimes we'd wrestle on the floor and punch each other playfully. And that was what we enjoyed doing sometimes. But I never did that with my teenage daughter. No, we never wrestled and punched each other, of course. And that's obvious. But they knew that my care for them, love of them, was absolutely equitable. So the message was, I got the message of the objective, which is, you know that I love you and care for you. How I do that does not have to be the same. And that's a major part, frankly, of the book, is that it's never about replicating things and sameness. It's about understanding the uniqueness that I need to bring to be an evolved leader, because a fundamental leader will execute the tasks well. The evolved leader will have the insight to how I can do it in a way that will raise that performance, that motivation, that inspiration. That's what I'm looking for. And that's what an evolved leader does instead.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.